in downtown LA now, the actual visual imagery and detail of this thing is, as I say, true on the ground, probably at La Défense and here in LA and probably nowhere else in the world. Now, Teague really is a very strange and very interesting character indeed, because he wrote a book which was the industrial designer's Bible in the 40s and the 50s, called Design This Day. We're having a good time up the back. Anyway, carry on for a bit. A book called Design This Day, which was, as I say, widely regarded as a kind of designer's Bible. It shows up in all sorts of collections, in all sorts of bibliographies and things like that. And what's in that book, really? No. I think I'll leave that mess as it was, and we'll just battle through it and see what happens. I told you it'd be a mumble towards the end. What's in that book, really, is a number of quite professional industrial designs. Can we have this lantern back in action, please, the right-hand one, and we'll see what we get. But supported by a body of argument which is really all the grand old rules of everybody who'd ever been anybody in the modern movement. He knew his Corbusier, he knew all sorts of other people. He also knew all the standard arguments about theories of proportion and stuff like that. Okay, oh, there's Texaco. That's one of the things he designed, anyhow. That was the Texaco stand for a exhibition in Dallas in 1936. Don't ask me why. But anyway, I mean, that sort of thing he designed, sort of thing he was kind of famous for. And it, nevertheless, over and above that, the book has, wow. Right. We're winning. All right, well, hang on a bit. Let's go back. I mean, what he did was this kind of engineering cleanup job. I mean, this is Walter Dorwin Teague, the designer in action, doing this kind of engineering cleanup job. There's your held internal grinder at the top before he got his hands on it. There's the held internal grinder at the bottom after he got his hands on it. It's cleaner and it's neater. And in fact, when I was an engineering apprentice during the war, Bristol Airplane Company, I worked on both types of held internal grinder, and I know what the difference is. The bottom one's easier to clean up. There's a disaster. Mechanically and functionally, there's no goddamn difference between the two things at all. It's the same grinding machine. It's only a casework job, as the saying goes in the business, but for the ordinary apprentice, it'd make life a lot simpler after something got mucked up and you've got the whole thing covered in bits of broken grinding wheel and things like that. It only took half the time to brush down this one. But what's interesting is that in doing that thing, what this man is doing really is pushing on Corbusier's law of natural selection, of mechanical selection, etc. The forms get simpler. The forms get simpler, the forms get more like the traditional, perfected shapes of Plato's philosophy and so on, not because mysterious, magical, natural forces of industry at work on them, but because a trained designer is doing it. Now, does that mean that he knows better than Corbu, or they both got it wrong, or what? I'm going to let that question lie for the moment, but I do want to hammer the resemblances between the two guys, because it is striking. I mean, they both make a big issue of the Parthenon, and that's Corbusier's Parthenon on the left and Walter Dorwin Teague's Parthenon on the right. And by gosh, I know, all right, it's always the same Parthenon. What's interesting is you pick so very nearly similar views, emphasizing the same details, the clarity of the stone cutting. Notice they both obviously fascinated by the pattern of, or their photographers were fascinated by the pattern of cast shadows of the columns, the lack of bases to the columns, the quality of the stone cutting, the quality of the entablature. Remember Corbusier's resemblance struck between the entablature of the Parthenon and the front end of the Delage car, etc., etc., etc. The two guys turn the argument on the Parthenon, but they turn it in a different way. And this is very important. Corbusier said of the Parthenon and the motor car, that the motor car is still an evolution and the Parthenon has got there. But Teague picks up a quotation from Horatio Greenough, from Greenough's American Architecture, written, like all the good words of modern architecture, written in 1843, in which Greenough says, could we carry into our civil architecture the responsibilities that weigh upon our shipbuilding, we could ere long have edifices as superior to the Parthenon as our modern battleships superior to the galleys of the Argonauts. For Corbusier, the process stops at the Parthenon. But for Walter Dorwin Teague, quoting Greenough, it doesn't. And Teague produces a very interesting indeed set of comparative images, getting a bit ahead of themselves on that side, and takes the Corbusian kind of argument of mechanical progress, but pushes it 2 stages further. I mean, the equivalent on that screen of Corbusier's Palladian aeroplane, the one at the bottom left over there, and then Teague goes 2 stages further to an early Bill Stout designed Ford plane at the top there, and the Douglas DC-2 at the bottom. Well, that brings us back to Santa Monica, doesn't it? Hello. And pushes the argument well beyond, pushes the visual argument well beyond Corbusier's point, and knows what he's doing, because he has some very interesting things indeed to say, lost them again, here we are, about the comparisons here on the right-hand screen. A short parabolic curve and a long sweep, straight or almost straight, our extraordinarily vigorous line, are our characteristic line of beauty. It recurs in all forms, streamlined for speed, but in many static forms as well. Here it is seen in the tail of a Douglas transport plane, up the top there, top left on the right-hand screen. This vigorous line frequently appears in modern structural forms, the steel and wood bridge from the administrative building, New York World's Fair, down the bottom here. Out of Walter Dorwin Teague's book, it almost appears that a whole American style of building and architecture got lost at the New York World's Fair. Something like this. Let's say, not an architecture related to the transportation technology of the 20s, an architecture related to the transportation technology of the 30s, and not just the transportation technology, because Teague also produces, in self-justification, this kind of structure from TVA dams and things like that. There is surely no more exciting form in modern design. But the line is significant wherever it occurs, and it forms have nothing to do with flight or with streamlining. It is, in fact, the ideal towards, and wait for it, the ideal towards which the Greek Doric capital was evolved. So he's coming back to the Parthenon again, and really picking up the Parthenon point, but saying, you know, and I'm sorry, I haven't got a slide of those particular diagrams from the book, that kind of curve that you get, in fact, that specifically, that double curve of the spillway on this side, slight curve that's running down and then flashing out at the bottom, which in fact does occur after a form in some Greek Doric capitals, is saying that that's his line of beauty. Now, it's a different thing to Corbusier's perfected eternal geometrical form. It's a much more dynamic thing. It's a much more properly American thing, I suppose, for that reason. And it does really run on and make sense in the work that Teague and people like Teague did for the 39-40 World's Fair. This is the Ford Pavilion. I don't think I've got the other slide. Oh, there's a bit more of your Dam and Douglas comparisons over there. Leave them on for a moment. This is the Ford Pavilion, the first clear vision offered to the American people of the freeway intersections of the future. They should be so lucky. But the Ford Road of the Future at the 39-45 World's Fair, which you can see is very interesting because down here you've got familiar Corbusier type staircases which everybody can do now. But the big spiralling ramps above and the way they intersect and so on really is something which the Corbusier generation never really got onto. Now, that's the last slide. I'd like to kill the projectors, please, for those valuable old slides cook. What's the point, what's the end product of all this? It's 2 things, really. That I think there is still a great deal more work to be done on this business of what did the forms mean to the men of the modern movement. They may have got it all wrong. I criticise them for getting it all wrong, and in a sense Colin Rowe too. it doesn't necessarily mean that you can just walk away from the propaganda that comes with the shapes and say, all right, they got it wrong, ignore that stuff, fellas, you know, carry on with the forms, cover New England with that stuff, and you'll get in all the architectural magazines and you'll be written up learnedly in Japan and in Italy and everywhere else, and people will stage forums about you and things of that kind of stuff, and you'll be the New York Five and you'll be famous. The New York Five, I mean, very much is about those forms deprived of the meanings which their inventors gave them. The piece of Colin Rowe criticising me is a very ingenious defence of those guys, saying, all right, you know, so the period got it wrong, but the forms are lovely, carry on with the forms. What I did wrong in Colin Rowe's eyes was saying the ideas were great and the forms were wrong. Which is something which I think anybody who, like myself, comes out of the engineering, not the architectural tradition, is bound at some point to say. That the sphere, the cone, and things like that are not really the natural forms of engineering. The natural forms of engineering, it comes out very clearly in Teague's book, which starts with a picture of, because it was all right in those unliberated days, picked the very first illustrations of a girl's legs. And the next pictures of girls' tits. Making some very basic points about functionalism and so forth. But also some very important points about what are the kinds of shapes that engineering tends to produce. And engineering tends to produce parabolic curves, tapers and things like that, stuff which in fact is not in the architecture of the 20s. Though it's in the architecture of people like Teague, which is what I find interesting about him, is that he tried, as it were, to keep up and sort out what were the kinds of shapes which were natural developments, like the oar or the woodman's axe, for instance, natural developments of the way tool design, product design, machine design really works. Now, I mean, you can play this either way, and I would say, I say this without intending any kind of compromise or phony peacemaking, that Colin Rowe and I are both right, provided we agree that the forms and the meanings belong together somehow. I'd say I'm right because those are the wrong forms for those meanings. But Colin Rowe is right for implying that those meanings would never have been understood without those forms, because they were forms to which architects were at some level accustomed, to which architecture lovers were accustomed, and therefore they could cotton the forms, and if the forms came with new labels tied to them, what Charlie Jenks calls altering the captions under the pictures, okay. You had manufactured, in a very shorthand way, a language of forms for talking about the condition of men and architecture in a mechanized century. But it was a manufactured language, an artificial language, which was fallible because of precisely what happened to technology and engineering design in that period. Now, so you can take either moral stance, I think. What you can't do, and I do feel this is extremely important, is to throw away the promises that were offered. Maybe the architecture of that period couldn't deliver on those promises. The performance fell behind the promises so often. The architecture was not cheap. The architecture was not always as weather-tight as it should have been. It did not make men happier. It did not prevent social revolution. It said all the other things that the modern architecture was supposed to be going to do. It didn't deliver on those promises. The performance wasn't necessarily there. Nevertheless, it was a recognition, in a sense, that those promises had to be made. And I guess this is probably where Rowe and I are miles apart. I think he would say, and many people would say with him, that architecture should never even try and promise to do what it doesn't know for certain it can do. It's a very reasonable proposition. On the other hand, if modern architecture or any other kind of architecture can't promise to do what the people of its time want it to do, has it any business at all in being around at that time? It's not a moral dilemma I find at all easy to solve. I'm one of these half and half people. I'm not an architect by origin. I'm an architect by corruption, I think is the right way to put it. Sorry, architect by contagion, I think is the right way to put it. I've been around with architects so long I begin to sound like one. But not to architects, fortunately. You know, I mean, and it's not enough because, I mean, many of my best friends are architects. I don't want to hit these guys too hard. I don't find it an easy moral dilemma to sort out. I don't think it's a moral dilemma which will go away if we decide to ignore it. I think adopting an ironical stance towards the architecture of the 20s, which is the New York 5 ploy, doesn't really get you anywhere at all. It gets you jobs from a limited range of rich, eccentric New England art lovers. Don't think it gets you much more beyond that, and it leaves you always in a morally exposed position. You're using a language which once had certain very important meanings. And no matter how much they may argue, the meanings won't go away. You can regard the whole thing as very funny, you can tut over it, you can wax ironical over it in the way that Peter Eisenman or Colin Rowe does. The meanings won't quite go away. You show someone a building with plain white surfaces stood up on stilts with strip windows running round it, and people will even now understand that building to make certain promises. The architect can say till he's blue in the face, I'm not offering those promises. It's just a house, nothing to do with the machine age at all. No one's going to believe that stuff. That kind of mythology of forms is part of the language in which we think in the 20th century, in the developed Western countries. We know that those shapes belong to those promises. Performance may not be there. The promise is still attached to the forms, and they won't go away. Whatever the New York 5 or Colin Rowe may preserve, but may propose, those buildings, I think, will always somehow be seen to have failed in terms of the normal understandings the 20th century has of its own architecture. Just what those normal understandings are, I think, might well be the subject for another lecture and not for tonight, because it's gone on rather a long time. But thank you all very much for listening anyhow. Yeah, do we want to do the questions scene? Or have I bored you all to sleep? I can see a hand, a large hand. Sorry, I got the wrong glasses on. Yeah.
It's probably very trite, but on that Gropius car, when the hinges were on both sides, did it function that way as well?
Well, it was an exhibition special. I think it was something of a photographer's special too. It was important to be able to show the inside. I think it was important to be able to swing the door either way for photographic and other purposes, because it did have one technical innovation. As far as we know, it's the first car designed with reclining seats of the modern type. There was a catch thing down here, and the back would go down. And people couldn't see that if you couldn't really get the door right out of the way. And I think the real reason for that was that. And I don't think you could, in fact, open the door at will either end, like you can those double-hung station wagon tailgates, you know. Or possibly, the other theory someone put to me is like the whole goddamn door just lifts out, you know, like in a Marx Brothers movie. But I can't get a clear story on this. I tried to talk to Gropius about it once, but Gropius was always well above the snow line as far as I was concerned, you know. It was very cold up there, and very few messages ever got down to my level, you know. I mean, I'm told that Gropius was a warm and lovable person, but to me it was like talking the north face of the Eiger. And it was one of those conversations which did not prosper. He thought he was being got at, and by God he was right too. He thought he was being got at, and you know, he just really walked away from the conversation. I tried to talk to Gideon about it, because Gideon's the guy who first managed to illustrate the car with the door wide open so you can actually see the reclining seat. And Gideon, in one of those mulish fits he used to get, couldn't understand what the question was about. You know, we showed him the picture, look, there are hinges there and there are hinges there. You know, and there's a door handle there and a door handle there. And he says it's a door which is the same at both ends. It was rather late at night. So I don't know. You know, I mean, historical research is still required. The mystery of the good doctor's door remains to be solved. You know. Sorry, hand at the back there.
Yeah. What do you think of Century City? And has this evolved entirely independently of modern architecture, or you know, how do you react to that?
Well, I mean, it's an off-the-peg downtown, isn't it? You know, I mean, you can go out and buy a downtown like that anywhere these days. You know, I mean, it's equipped, not furnished, and all that kind of stuff. You know, I mean, it's an ex-catalogue downtown area. You know,
does it work as architecture?
I think some of it works as architecture, some of it works as planning. You know, I don't think any of it would work as well as Teague's rebuilt San Francisco would have worked. But that, I think, is another whole question. Yeah.
Would you follow up on your remarks about the way the highway in downtown Los Angeles fits in with the city?
Well, no, it's only a question of, I'd say, the particular imagery which Teague is offering there. You know, so sorry, you didn't get the slide. It's a fat slide that wouldn't work in your skinny projectors. I mean, in that slide, or you can look it up in the book if you can find a copy of the book. You'll see that you've got like what you see in the slide is there's this kind of spaceman with padded shoulders in the foreground and a close-fitting Bellstar thing on his head, leaning over this balcony, looking at the city. And down there is a double file of towers with a very complicated system of freeways and overbridges between the double file of towers. Now, the only place in the world until recently that looked anything like that was the bit where the Pasadena goes up the side of downtown Los Angeles. I'm not saying it's good or bad, so it's the only place it actually happened. And the next place it actually happened is La Défense at Paris, where for complicated reasons of French planning and non-planning, you finish up, in fact, with a body of urban imagery which looks surprisingly like downtown Los Angeles, one of the great freaks. But when the French do the American thing, they do, as they say, the whole bit, you know. And, you know, they swear that it didn't set out to imitate downtown LA, but by gosh, it really looks like it. But it's just that particular imagery of towers, freeways, and multiple level overpasses close down to the freeways, many of them curving, as some of the overbridges do over the Pasadena. And that's all it is. I mean, it just happens that that's the only places I can think of where that particular imagery of a machine-age downtown can't look anything like coming true. That's all I was saying. You know, it's not a value judgment on downtown LA, and that's another subject for another lecture. Mm-hmm.
Dwell on the machine age, and I know you've written a book on it, and now you're going through today. So I wonder whether you're into the ecological thing, or what is that to you?
Well, I mean, the concept of the machine age is a historical fact which won't go away. You know, I mean, I could make a number of value judgments about whether or not there ought to have been a concept of a machine age, and it was certainly right round the twist in some ways, a particular enthusiasm that went into it, you know. I think it's easy enough to recognize nowadays were potentially ecologically, humanly, socially disastrous. But it looked good in the 1920s. You know, and I think it's something which is tough to have to face up to. That much of the architecture, which at architecture school and elsewhere we've been brought up to admire, is the product of an ideology which many of us would now find repugnant. It's an ideology which accepts big business industry, which accepts very high rates of technological concentration, which is energy intensive and capital intensive rather than people intensive, and so on and so forth. You know, but it is a historical fact that that is the mood in which the great masters of modern architecture came to be the great masters of modern architecture. It's the mood which inspired the visual ideology which produced Century City, for instance. And it is, because it is one of the great mythologies of the 20th century, it still has, as I've been hinting, very considerable power to move, to stir, to dismay, to annoy, etc. But it still has power. And I think the ecological movement would have been much weaker in its own mythology if it had not had all that stuff to react against. All right, so by the time it got to be 1970 and Mies van der Rohe was dead and that kind of stuff, you know, it was a style just about at the end of its tether. But it had been, up to that point, the dominant style of the 20th century in most parts of the world. It's an extraordinary thing. That particular style of architecture, with those particular mechanistic pretensions, has been the most durable ism of the 20th century. An ism in painting or sculpture is lucky to last 10 years. The international style architecture, the white becoming black architecture of the international style, has something like a 50-year run, which is but I thought it's because architecture is slow and permanent and so on. And it's the most durable style the 20th century has seen so far. And it's probably left permanent scars on the 20th century's understanding of itself and the world it finds itself in. And the reaction towards the ecological attitude would not have been half as violent, as powerful, or as successful if there had not been that 50-year, you can call it dominance or tyranny or whatever. You can use a good word or a bad word, but it was there for 50 years. It was the dominating vision, Frank Lloyd Wright not excluded, the dominating vision of how the new world of the 20th century was going to be built. From the very earliest projects of the futurists in the 19-teens, to Teague, to, you know, Century City. You know, I mean, it's all basically the same imagery coming through. It's a very, very long run. And as I say, it's going to take the 20th century and the 21st century a very long time to recover from that stuff. Yeah. Not with the same clarity. You know, I've been looking quite a lot at dead futures recently, and that's one of the biggest dead futures of the lot, you know, which is really based on Manhattan, ultimately. You know, high density, high technology city of high buildings. The example was always Manhattan in various versions. Now, that's now seen to be a dead future, I think, by most people. But we don't have, even out of China yet, a future to replace it. I think one of our problems at the moment is we don't know what the future is going to look like anymore. You know, so we're kind of flapping about loose. Every man has to invent his own future now, instead of there being a publicly accepted future, which I think is probably, well, it inspired Mayor Yorty, if not Mayor Bradley, shall we say. You know, but it was a future in good currency until very, very recently indeed. Sorry, you had a question there.
What do you think about Rossi and the Rationalist group?
Boy, do I know a loaded question when I hear one. I have a permanent falling out with Aldo Rossi because I didn't mention him in 4 lectures on megastructures I did in Naples.
What about Léon Krier?
Well, you get to the Kriers, you're talking about people I know and love, not necessarily as architects, though. But I mean, Leo and Rob, you know, really did something for Jim Sterling's office, like put the papers in order for a start. And helped to put the book together and a few things. I mean, particularly Leo. And if anybody says that stuff is just Beaux-Arts revival, I'd say if you rephrase that in German, I'll agree with you. You know, I mean, because it's beautiful, it's brilliant, and it's neoclassicism all over again. Its virtue, from my point of view, is it illustrates again how powerful are the neoclassical roots of, what do we call it now? Traditional modern architecture, pre-ecological modern architecture. You know, it is very securely based, ultimately, in a neoclassical tradition. It's behind Corbusier's admiration for the Parthenon. It's behind most of Gropius's design, which he would himself admit goes back somehow to Carl Friedrich Schinkel and the great neoclassicists of early 19th century. I mean, Gropius's own ancestors worked with Schinkel, worked in the Schinkel style. You know, Mies would have not the slightest doubt that he was a product of a neoclassical tradition. I mean, to hear Mies talk about Schinkel, talk about Boulez and people like that was really fantastic. You know, it was Mies talking about something which really meant something to him, the true grand old rules of modern architecture. And it comes back still very powerfully within that same Kraut tradition with the Kriers, and curious enough in Jim Sterling as well, who got it in a roundabout way from people like Colin Rowe when he was a student, because Colin Rowe really is a classical scholar before and more than. He's a scholar of modern architecture. And I mean, it's fun, I mean, looking at it as a historian, I find it very useful, very interesting to be reminded again that many of the roots, the formal roots of modern architecture are struck very deep in the neoclassical tradition. But if you're asking me, should we go out and build it right now, my answer is you've got to be joking, which I think is an answer which Leo would appreciate, but not Rossi. No.
Do you think it's fascist?
No. Try again. Because a building is symmetrical, it doesn't make it fascist. It may simply mean it contains 2 of everything anyhow. Right? You know, I mean, one of my great studio rows was with a nice American who came and taught first year with us, and I won't bother with his name now, you know. And we had one student who came in effectively at second year level. She'd done psychology before, She never even tried to draw a building in her life. Well, she'd done a few drawings of her native Dublin, you know, scenes in back alleys and that kind of thing. She was faced with the problem of designing a building for one of the, like the next student on her left, you know. The next student on her right was designing a building for her. They all took, you know, everybody was designing the next person's dream house, you know. And she was designing a building for this guy who came from Barbados and was going back to Barbados, you know. And I really knew exactly what he wanted. And you know, she was sort of, you know, holding the pencil like this and trying to draw straight lines, you know, kind of stuff. And the more she looked at the building, the more it seemed to fall naturally into two halves. So I said, let it fall into two halves. You know, I said, it's a kind of two of everything building, like two families and that kind of thing, you know. Make it match up, see how it looks then. You're not going to make any other kind of sense of it at this stage in your development, you know. So she did this thing. You know, and as an educational exercise for her, it was quite something. You know, she came on like 10 years of architecture school in 3 weeks, just getting a set of rooms into a comprehensible shape. The other guy who was on this team with me failed it out of hand because it was fascist, because it had a symmetrical facade. And a nice, sincere, New York, non-Jewish architect. you know, a sincere believer in ecology and all that stuff, you know. You show him a symmetrical building and he just goes syndrome, with no other word for it, you know. Show him a symmetrical building and he says fascist, you know. Been listening, I admit he'd been talking to Charlie Jenks not long before. But, you know, I mean, and just because it's got a line down the middle and what's on the left is also on the right, doesn't make it fascist. Because the architecture of Berlin was neoclassical, long before Hitler was around, long before lovely Albert Speer, the favourite of the architectural historians, was around, you know, long before the Nazi revival started in the architecture schools. You know, neoclassicism always came in that package. And neoclassicism in Berlin, and indeed to some extent also in Vienna, is in fact the style of social progress, just as in North America, symmetrical buildings are the style of Jeffersonian democracy, and don't let Frank Lloyd Wright kid you otherwise, you know. And just because things are symmetrical doesn't make them fascist. Some of the words that come with some of the Krier style designs may be rather fascist sounding words. It's very easy for an architect to sound fascist, even when he's trying not to. It's something to do with the language of architecture, not to do with the language of the Kriers, you know. But that kind of neoclassicism is not necessarily fascist, you know. And the more that more they look back to the true neoclassicism, the real, when neoclassicism was neo, around 1800, the more they take a stand on the kind of concepts of totally un-fascist democracy on which the constitution of this great bicentennial country was founded, you know. It'll be nice for the next symmetrical building you see. It may be on your side. Yeah, that's stirring a lot. Right. But one at a time, please.
What feelings, though, derive out of those? You know, that symmetry or that, how do you say, all-inspiring Capitol building?
What I find, I get all that sort of crap, whether it's in a Krier drawing or whether it's in Washington, D.C., is a style that died on us because, you know, it got, in nearly every case, it got too abstracted, you know. I mean, Washington is full of dead monuments to good ideas that don't happen to exist in the rest of the United States, like Treasury, you know, which, I mean, there may be ideas in good standing in Washington, D.C., but who needs to know that stuff out in the real life of the United States? That very much of what's in the Krier drawings and in some of the other so-called rationalist drawings is simply symmetry for its own sake. It's not symmetry that has something to say by means of the symmetry about things like the human being a roughly symmetrical organism.
Yes, but you're not sitting. I mean, when a human being starts to interact, it's hardly ever. Instead, it's like if he interacts with a symmetrical human being, he's a soldier or a tension, you know.
But even if I lie flat on my back, I'm still symmetrical, you know, unless I self-consciously try to do something about it, you know. I mean, if you look carefully, you can see why symmetrical me is not symmetrical in this symmetrical chair at the moment. It's because whatever mutt put this chair on here didn't put it on the line of the axle of the wheel. What? That's not bullshit, that's why it is. If I put my feet here, I fall straight through. Come on now. Is there a functionalist in the house? Symmetry means what you make it mean. It is only, at one level, a symbolic form, like Corbusier's cylinders and spheres, like Walter Dorwin Teague's girls' legs and girls' tits. You put them in a picture, they mean, roughly speaking, what the caption underneath says they're supposed to mean. Albert Speer does a symmetrical building, that's fascist. Thomas Jefferson does a symmetrical building, that's democratic. Right?
No, I don't agree.
Well, what's wrong with it?
I don't agree with you're relating directly to the politics of the building. I'm relating to it in terms of a feeling or something that's derived out of that proportion in front of you. When you're dealing directly with whatever power was in at the time. Now, when I go
right. I mean, the power that's in at the time builds the buildings. You don't build buildings unless you're prepared to compromise with the powers that are at your time. And this is the first fact that architects have to learn If you're going to be an architect, you've got to learn to compromise with the status quo, and that's very tough. And that's one of the things that architecture school shields too many people against, particularly on the teaching staff. Sorry. Well, you were so quiet there with your hand up. You weren't shouting or waving or anything.
Do you think we talked about the various meanings of the architecture of the 20s and 30s. Do you think that it has a social or political promise involved in its forms?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the more specific things. Corbusier says architecture or revolution. And really the Germans said architecture and revolution, but the two things belong very closely together. What Colin Rowe in some other paper, I think in a brilliant phrase, calls the transcendental socialism of the 20s, that modern architecture is, by its origins, by the kind of men who dreamed it up, linked to the idea of social improvement by large-scale social action. Modern architecture may not be democratic, in fact, in the American individualistic sense of the word. It's certainly, in its intentions, democratic in the European collectivist sense of the word. And it's very, very closely linked to those things. And that certainly is part of the promise. It's very difficult outside Eastern Europe for a left-wing type of government. I say left-wing type advisory because I'm thinking about those that we've had in England over the last several years, to build other than in something like the international style. I mean, most of the, as it were, what you might call, there's a nice phrase to describe English post-war architecture, which is building in the 50s, designs of the 30s you'd hope to put up in the 40s. And that kind of stuff, which comes with the blessing of the nicest kind of English socialist do-gooders, is inevitably in the international style. The tower blocks in which the working classes of London have been neatly packaged until quite recently are direct echoes of the tower blocks in Le Corbusier's 1923 plan for Paris, And the low terraces, the four-story walk-ups, are ultimately echoes of that Gropius housing at Dammerstock, which was on that screen on that side. And that certainly belongs. But it is probably one of the things that style lost when it crossed the Atlantic, and it may be the tragedy of people like Gropius in America. They didn't realize it lost it. I think it's quite possible as that style crossed the Atlantic, then Gebhard's law inexorably applied, and the socialist ideology fell out when nobody was looking. And by the time it arrived in New England, it had simply become a style. You can see it happening to people like Schindler and Neutra over here. I mean, those men were socialists in Europe of one sort or another. They looked to the new, you look at say, Neutra's Rush City project, I mean, that is a great European Siedlung, social housing scheme. But by the time the bits and pieces of Rush City get implemented by being cribbed by people like Lou Kahn, for instance, then all that's disappeared. They are simply building forms. If they mean anything at all, the meanings are purely American ones and have lost all contact with that European socialist background. But certainly those things were there, and I say lost all contact. I'm sorry, I have exaggerated, because I said earlier on that, say, even in the work of the New York School, those meanings won't quite go away even now. And I think something of that does still attach. To some extent, even in the United States, the international style goes with things like the New Deal and that concept of, what do we say, social improvement by federal intervention or whatever.
Well, Matthias Ungers was over at UCLA assuming that he was fascist and he was apolitical, but he comes out of a very socialist European background.
Right.
And it seems as if he's saying his architecture is apolitical, is a political stance.
Yeah, if you could convolute that about 3 more layers, you get pretty close to what Ungers is probably about. I mean, Ungers is the man who, as it were, started the revival of interest in, say, the Berlin socialist expressionists of the early 1920s. He had a fantastic collection of stuff in the house in Berlin, pamphlets from 1921 put out by the Arbeitsrat für Kunst and that kind of stuff, But quite suddenly, when people began, and other people began to take that stuff seriously and ask him about it, he began to back off. He said, well, some of those guys became fascists, which is true. I mean, lots of people in Germany became fascists. Let's face it, it was the price of survival, particularly architects. But he began to back off. And again, whatever the meanings that might have been in his mind when he started to do the kind of stuff he's doing now, when people lean on him, he starts to back away from that because he doesn't want to be cornered with a particular ideological package, tacked on to a particular formal package. There are very few architects actually have, the hard guts to sweat through that kind of proposition. It is very tough indeed to say these particular forms in my work belong to this particular political attitude. You can say it. They've had to go on saying about the same forms and the same political attitude 5 years later. It gets to be very embarrassing and very, very boring. And it's very interesting in England, the way the stylistic preferences of the left, though they've usually come back to something like the international style, have shuffled round 2-story cottage housing, gone some way towards archigram and then veered back the other way. Because, I suppose, in the end, and we're slightly picking up in a funny way some of your points from earlier on, large hand at the back there, that visual imagery is however tightly you draw it, is still imprecise in its meanings. It always, it tends to pick up other meanings. And you can never quite nail a particular form to a particular political sentiment, because it will have had a previous history in many cases before that particular political group got hold of it, and it'll pick up other meanings on the side. I mean, visual symbols are potent, but they're also ambiguous. Otherwise, no visual artist would be in business, I suspect. I mean, everybody reads a bit of their own stuff into it, as well as the stuff which belongs in one way or another. And exactly what I've been saying about symmetrical buildings being fascist in one context and democratic in another is not just literalism. It is the sort of things that happens to visual symbols. You can never quite pin it down, but certainly, I mean, to go back to where we were, as far as the international style is concerned, its ancestry is somehow socialistic in the American version of the phrase, and Ungers is Ungers/Krier quasi-neoclassicism, which in a sense has to include people like Archizoom and Superstudio as well, and the rest of those extremely linear graphic big form people, really carries with it still some of the ambiguities of that neoclassical tradition, which stands at one extreme for democracy, but another extreme, say in its French Revolutionary instances, for an extremely, I don't know how you phrase this, dictatorial view of democracy, an extremely formal, tightly structured view of democracy. People begin to shuffle their feet. I don't blame them, I must say. Right, one last question.
Why do you feel that Radford included with the quite always advocated the use of the machine as a way of revolutionizing architecture, but in his own work he always seemed to be pre-ecological and post-technological?
I think that's simply another way of saying that the ecological movement is primarily American in its origins. I mean, because you can make exactly the same points about Mumford. I mean, Lewis Mumford, you read him one way, and he's a 1920s mechanisticist, whatever the word is, and you read him another way on a different day, and he sounds like the first prophet of the ecological movement. And it's something to do with the language of America, I think, rather than the language of the machine age or the language of the ecological movement. You know, the ecological movement as we have it is primarily not just an American invention, a bloody California invention, let's face it, if they didn't invent it up in Oregon. But, you know, but it does, you know, and I think it's largely a question of as much a question of use of language, tone of voice, and that kind of thing. Wright himself changed his viewpoints many times, but, you know, the machine was usually a friend to him, but it reads it in different ways. And, you know, those early lectures, like the Hull House lecture, The Art and Craft of the Machine, the vision of the city, when he takes the imaginary viewer up to the top of a tall building in Chicago and shows him the city at night under the pall of smog, and that fantastic bit about the train tearing through the bridges and so on, that is the vision of the machine age city in its most extreme and most mechanistic form, you know. And much of the rest of that lecture is very gentle, almost ecological, you know. I think it's just Frank Lloyd Wright is his own man, making himself up as he goes along. But the vision which he produces there is very close to the vision which the futurists were to produce in Europe 5 or 6 years later, and which is the underlying vision then of Corbusier's view of the city, Gropius's view of the city to some extent, my beloved master Nicholas Pevsner's view of the city to some extent, Walter Dorwin Teague's view of the city, Commissioner Robert Moses' view of the city, you know. It sort of turns back again and again on that vision of Manhattan and Chicago, the loop in Chicago, as the city of the future, you know. And Wright is as much part of that tradition as he is part of the backwoods, you know, Jeffersonian democracy, pioneering broadacre city view of the city and of America as well. His virtue, and to some extent his problem in this, was being 10 years too old. You know, he got there almost too early. And it left him always, not 10 years out of phase, but 5 years out of phase of what other people were doing and where other people were going. But you can, you know, I mean, if you want to play the game of, like sort of McCarthy techniques of quoting people against themselves, you know, you can prove Frank Lloyd Wright either the most woolly-minded ecologist or the most fascist machine worshipper, simply according to which phrases you pick, you know. And you do exactly the same thing to Gropius. And Gropius himself was a master at rigging the evidence on this kind of thing. If you said Gropius said a certain thing in 1923, and that was an unpopular thing for him to have said, to be recalled in 1947, by return of post, more or less, Gropius would send a carbon of a lecture he gave the next day or the day before, which said exactly the opposite, you know. And he got, the whole office got so practiced at this, they would occasionally get it wrong. And again, my beloved master said that Gropius said something or other about the future of the city, you know, in 1921. And Gropius wrote back and said, no, I did not say that about the future of the city in 1921. Here is the carbon of a lecture I gave on January the 14th, 1921, which will prove the contrary. And what his secretary in fact had sent was a carbon of his accounts for a day spent in New York in January 1951, serving on a committee of the AIA. But I think it's a suitably ridiculous note on which to finish.
I want to ask you a question. I wanted to know what the budget crisis and the monetary crisis is going to, how it's going to affect architecture. For example, if the Labour Party austerity program were implemented in Britain, what would go up? What would be built?
That's an impossible question to answer, mate. Come on now.
You had interesting comments about what went up, you know, in the financial crisis of the 30s, and you talking about the German currency and how that was involved in building.
Well, I mean, in the 20s and in the 30s, the standard cure for economic crisis was public works. You know, at present levels of taxation, that isn't quite such a hopeful prospect. You know, I mean, in those days it was possible to drum up the money to do those kind of things. It's not just a hopeful prospect at the moment, because even in England people are beginning to grumble about the level of taxation and be stroppy about it. But I certainly wouldn't like to hazard a guess on how that thing's going to turn out.
Seems like very little's going to go up.
What?
Seems like there's going to be very little building.
Well, in fact, the public building program is at the moment quite a lot down, but it's beginning to pick up again at the moment. But no one quite knows. No one can even begin to predict how it's going to go, because no one can at the moment see where the pound is going to level off, if it ever levels off. No one can quite see. I mean, in some ways, the worst thing that's happened to the pundits was the improvement in the unemployment figures last month, you know, which have arrived 6 months too early. You know, it's nice for the people who are no longer unemployed, but it's actually thrown our economic profits of both weal and woe into a great state of tizzy, because they don't know how it's all going to turn out now. You know, I mean, you're asking me a hell of a question. And I'm sorry, this is not a cop-out answer. I think nobody in England knows how things are going to turn out, because no one can read even how the day-to-day process of the economic situation is going. You know, why unemployment goes up and down one way, the pound goes up and down another way, the stock market goes up and down another way, all out of phase of one another in a way that no one can relate, which Keynesian economics and nobody else's economics has prepared us for at all.
Well, that very uncertainty is significant because it makes planning impossible.
Yeah.
Planning's always been impossible. That's why when things look good in the middle 1960s, you know, this paper came out which caused a great stir and has still not been understood, called Failure Planning, whose proposal was not to produce master plans for what should happen, but simply draw a line round what is acceptable and say, now if we reach this critical wrong condition or that one, we'll act. But in the meantime, we'll let things run on and find their own way. And that came out at the time when directive planning in England was plausible and sounded reasonable. But even then, you know, people were beginning to say that kind of master plan planning won't work and never has worked, you know. The history of town planning in terms of master plans is the biggest and most expensive trash can in the world. You know, and it's a hard fact to take because so many good men and true have produced master plans. But the number of master plans, percentage of master plans that have come to anything that's been any use to anybody is infinitesimal. And even when things looked good in the 60s, any sensible review of the previous 50 years of town planning had to come up with the conclusion that town planning as generally understood, you know, was too uncertain to be proceeded with any further. And all right, I mean, if the present budgetary and other crisis in England makes a more general realization of that, that's a healthy move in one way. But if you abandon the concept of planning in that sort of sense, what are people going to work for? What are people going to want? What are people going to see as the direction in which they're heading? And that's a problem which we can't resolve at the moment. And you know, and I don't think anybody has any idea how we're going to get out of that one. You know, I mean, Dan Burnham said, "Make no little plans," etc., etc. But one thing we do know about nowadays is that big plans don't work. So you're going to go on making little plans that don't have the power to set fire to men's souls and hope for the best. Are you going to do something completely different? But that's a fix. It doesn't just apply in England anymore. You know, it applies to the planning of every major city nowadays. Well, that's a good gloomy note on which to finish.
No, I don't think so. Very good. Did you feel? Why do you think?
And also,
Really?
argument of the judge is the same old serpent that says, you work and I'll eat. You toil, I'll enjoy the fruits of it. Turn it whatever way you will, whether it come from the mouth of a king as an excuse for enslaving the people of his country, or from the mouth of the men of one race as an excuse for enslaving the men of another race. It is the same old serpent. Now you take our old declaration, which declares that all men are equal, and you say that is not the truth, then let us take the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. Who is so bold as to do it? If it's not true, let us tear it out. But if it is true, let's stick to it then. Let's turn this country back into the channel in which the framers of the Constitution originally placed it. Let us stand firmly by each other. Let's end all this quibbling about this man, the other man, this race and that race and the other race being inferior. Let us end all this quibbling and unite as one people throughout this land, so that we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal.
In the remarks I make on this platform, I mean nothing personally disrespectful to my opponent. I first met Abe Lincoln in the state legislature and had sympathy with him for the uphill struggle we both had in life. He was just as good at telling an anecdote then as he is now. He could ruin more liquor than all the boys in the town together. And the dignity with which he presided at a fist fight excited the admiration and won the praise of everybody present.
Yeah, he's not going to do that day.
Whilst in Congress, however, Mr. Lincoln distinguished himself by his opposition to the Mexican War and took the side of the common enemy against his own country. And when he returned home, he found the indignation of the people followed him everywhere.
Now, just a minute. Judge Douglas is at fault when he charges me with having opposed our soldiers in the Mexican War. He knows that whenever asked to endorse the origin or justice of that war, I refused such endorsement and voted against it. But whenever asked for land grants or for anything to pay our soldiers in Mexico, during all that time, I gave the same vote that Judge Douglas did. Now, you may think what you please about whether or not that was consistent, but such is the truth, and the judge has the right to make whatever he can out of it.
If Mr. Lincoln is a man of bad character, I leave you to find out. If his course on the Mexican War was not in accordance with your notions of patriotism and fidelity to our own country as against a common enemy, I leave you to ascertain the fact. I have no assaults to make upon him other than to trace his course. This is a contest of principle. Either the radical abolition principles of Mr. Lincoln must be maintained, or the strong constitutional national democratic principles with which I am identified.
You have said that before. Fellow citizens, if you are going to set about to devise the best instrument by which to change public sentiment in the free states to accept slavery, could you find an instrument so capable of doing it as Judge Douglas? He, by his vast personal influence and prestige, is in every possible way preparing the public mind for making the institution of slavery national and perpetual. Those are the principles by which he is identified.
It has not yet apparently penetrated Mr. Lincoln's honorable brain that his principles are in every possible way preparing the public mind for war!
No!
What is my duty? In order to preserve the Union, and I will do it! Under any circumstances, I will pursue no course of conduct that will give just cause for the dissolution of the Union. For the hope of the downtrodden and oppressed peoples of this world. For the hope of the friends of freedom throughout the world rests on the perpetuity of this Union. I am for peace forever between the states. Now, my time, and the time of the debates, draws to a close. I shall be satisfied whatever way you decide.